The morning air at Rechlin Test Center hung thick with anticipation on the 12th of May, 1944. Oberst Werner Bombach watched as the morning sun glinted off rows of freshly painted Messerschmitt 109s lined up on the tarmac, 63 of them, delivered just that week from the Regensburg factories. Advanced models, fitted with the latest modifications. The kind of aircraft that, on paper at least, should have been decimating Allied bomber formations over the Reich. Instead, they sat silent, their propellers motionless, their fuel tanks empty. Bombach had been ordered to conserve aviation gasoline. The directive came from the top, vague but insistent, and it carried with it the unmistakable odor of desperation. What he couldn't have known, standing there in the pale spring light, was that this moment marked the beginning of the end, not because Germany lacked aircraft, but because it lacked the single substance that made them anything more than expensive sculptures of aluminum and steel. This is the story of how the Luftwaffe, at the height of its production capacity, was systematically grounded by an invisible enemy it could neither outfly nor outfight. It's the story of what happened when Hitler and his high command confronted a truth more devastating than any battlefield defeat, that all the engineering genius in the world meant nothing without fuel. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand how Germany arrived at this catastrophic juncture, we must first examine the industrial system that Hitler and his Minister of Armaments, Albert Speer, had constructed with such pride. By early 1944, the Reich's aviation industry was performing what could only be described as a miracle of production. Despite relentless Allied bombing campaigns that had pulverized cities like Hamburg and Cologne, German factories were churning out more aircraft than ever before. The numbers were staggering. In January of 1944 alone, German manufacturers delivered over 2,200 combat aircraft to the Luftwaffe. By September of that year, monthly production would peak at over 3,000 aircraft. The annual total for 1944 would reach approximately 36,000 combat aircraft, more than any previous year of the war. This extraordinary output was the culmination of Speer's reorganization of German war production. After his appointment as armaments minister in February of 1942, Speer had streamlined manufacturing, eliminated redundancies, and mobilized a massive workforce that included hundreds of thousands of slave laborers from concentration camps and occupied territories. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, Germany's primary single-engine fighter, was rolling off assembly lines at a rate of over 13,000 units in 1944 alone. The Focke-Wulf 190, considered superior to many Allied fighters in certain combat scenarios, was being produced by the thousands. Even the revolutionary Messerschmitt 262 jet fighter, the world's first operational jet-powered combat aircraft, was entering production with high hopes that its 600-mile-per-hour speed would turn the tide of the air war. German propaganda trumpeted these achievements. Newsreels showed factories humming with activity, workers assembling fuselages with Germanic precision, and test pilots putting new aircraft through their paces. The message was clear: despite the bombing, despite the advancing Allied armies, German industry remained potent, innovative, defiant. For the ordinary German, these images provided a desperately needed source of hope. Perhaps the Führer's promises of wonder weapons and ultimate victory weren't entirely delusional after all. But there was a problem, one that became catastrophically clear on the afternoon of the 12th of May, 1944. On that day, 935 heavy bombers of the United States 8th Air Force struck 6 synthetic fuel plants across central Germany. The targets included the massive hydrogenation facilities at Luna, Lutskendorf, Bohlen, Zeitz, and Brucks, the industrial heart of Germany's synthetic oil production. These plants, utilizing the Fischer-Tropsch and Berdius hydrogenation processes, converted Germany's abundant coal reserves into usable aviation gasoline and diesel fuel. They were the lifeblood of the Wehrmacht's motorized forces and the Luftwaffe's aerial armada. Germany, unlike the United States with its vast Texas and California oilfields, possessed minimal natural petroleum resources. The oilfields around Ploesti in Romania had supplied a significant portion of Germany's crude oil, but these were already under sustained Allied attack. By 1944, Germany was producing approximately 9 million barrels of synthetic fuel annually, impressive by any measure of chemical engineering, but desperately insufficient for the fuel-hungry German war machine. In the first 4 months of 1944, Germany had produced 546,000 tons of aviation fuel, with 503,000 tons coming from synthetic fuel by hydrogenation. This production barely met current operational needs, with no margin for error. When the American bombers struck on May 12, the results were immediate and devastating. At Luna, the Reich's largest synthetic fuel plant, massive explosions ripped through the hydrogenation towers. Flames consumed storage tanks filled with partially refined fuel. Production lines that had operated around the clock fell silent. Within days, similar attacks hit other synthetic fuel facilities. By the end of May, Germany's aviation fuel production had been slashed by more than half. From a monthly output of 175,000 tons in April, production collapsed to just over 92,000 tons in May. The crisis brought Albert Speer to Hitler's East Prussian headquarters at the Wolf's Lair. The armaments minister carried with him devastating production reports and a blunt assessment. In a meeting whose details Speer would later recount in his memoirs, he told Hitler, "The enemy has struck us at one of our weakest points. If they persist at this time, we will soon no longer have any fuel production worth mentioning. Our one hope is that the other side has an Air Force general staff as scatterbrained as ours." The bitter irony in Speer's final comment reflected years of frustration. The German High Command had long debated the merits of strategic bombing, with many, including Hitler himself, dismissing attacks on industrial infrastructure as wasteful distractions from direct military confrontation. The Luftwaffe had focused its efforts on tactical support of ground forces and, during the Battle of Britain, on terror bombing of cities rather than systematic destruction of Britain's industrial capacity. Now the Americans and British were demonstrating what Germany had failed to grasp, that modern warfare was as much about industrial endurance as battlefield prowess. Hitler's response to Speer's warning revealed the Führer's fundamental misunderstanding of industrial warfare. Rather than immediately redirecting resources to defend fuel production or acknowledging the severity of the crisis, Hitler remained fixated on offensive weapons, the V-1 flying bombs and V-2 rockets that he believed would break British morale, and the jet fighters that would sweep Allied bombers from German skies. He authorized only minimal additional resources for fuel plant defense and repair. The Allies, thankfully for their cause, were not scatterbrained. General Karl Spaatz, commander of the United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, had long advocated for targeting Germany's oil industry. Intelligence analysts had identified petroleum as the Wehrmacht's critical vulnerability. Now, with long-range P-51 Mustang fighters available to escort bombers deep into German territory, the Allies possessed the means to execute a sustained campaign. Throughout June and July, American and British bombers returned again and again to Germany's synthetic fuel plants. Each raid found the facilities partially repaired from the previous attack, their German and foreign workers laboring desperately to restore production. Each raid inflicted new damage, killed more skilled technicians, and pushed the fuel crisis deeper. By the end of June, aviation fuel stocks had fallen to 370,000 tons, a 70% operational reserve that was being consumed faster than it could be replenished. Luftwaffe squadrons across Germany and occupied Europe began receiving increasingly strict fuel allocation orders. Training flights were curtailed. Bomber operations, already reduced to a fraction of their earlier scale, were further limited. Fighter units found themselves rationing fuel for defensive scrambles against Allied bomber formations. The impact rippled through every level of the Luftwaffe. At fighter bases across Germany, maintenance crews developed desperate fuel-saving procedures. Pilots were ordered not to taxi their aircraft after landing. Instead, as soon as the wheels touched the runway, pilots would cut their engines and allow momentum to carry the aircraft to a stop. Ground crews would then rush out with teams of oxen, yes, oxen, the very symbol of pre-industrial agriculture, to tow multi-million Reichsmark fighter aircraft to their dispersal pens. The sight was both comic and tragic, the world's most technologically advanced air force reduced to using livestock for basic aircraft handling. pilots returning from intercept missions over central Germany would shut down their engines while still thousands of feet in the air, gliding unpowered to their airfields to conserve every possible liter of fuel. This practice, while economical, was extraordinarily dangerous. A pilot misjudging his glide path had no reserve power to correct. Crashes increased. Experienced pilots, already an increasingly scarce resource, were being killed not in combat but in fuel-saving procedures necessitated by the collapsing petroleum supply. By August of 1944, the crisis had metastasized into full catastrophe. American strategic bombing raids on the 28th and 29th of May had targeted the Ploesti refineries in Romania with devastating effect. 24 separate bombing missions that summer involving 5,633 bomber sorties systematically destroyed the Ploesti complex. When Soviet forces overran Romania on the 22nd of August, 1944, the Ploesti fields, which had supplied roughly 25% of the Axis power's refined oil products, were lost entirely. Germany's petroleum situation, already critical, became catastrophic. The synthetic fuel plants, subjected to continuous bombing, could barely function. The heroic repair efforts that Speer's organization had mobilized could not keep pace with the destruction. Many facilities operated at a fraction of capacity, if at all. Production figures told the story in stark numerical terms. In June, 76,000 tons. In July, 53,000 tons. By September, between the 11th and 19th of that month, not a single ton of high-grade aviation fuel was produced anywhere in the Reich. Not 1 ton. The industrial machine that had produced 175,000 tons just 4 months earlier had ground to a complete halt. For Luftwaffe commanders, the mathematics were brutal and unavoidable. The Reich had thousands of aircraft, more than ever before, but each fighter required approximately 200 liters of fuel for a single operational sortie. A bomber needed thousands of liters. Pilot training, which had already been reduced from the pre-war standard of 250 hours to barely 150 hours, was cut further. New pilots arrived at combat squadrons with as few as 110 hours of total flight time, less than half the training time of their Allied counterparts who averaged 225 hours. These undertrained pilots, thrust into combat against experienced Allied flyers, died at horrific rates. The average life expectancy of a newly assigned Luftwaffe fighter pilot in late 1944 was measured in days, somewhere between 8 and 30 days from first combat mission to death or capture. The fuel shortage created a vicious cycle from which there was no escape. Lack of fuel meant inadequate training. Inadequate training meant rapid pilot losses. Rapid pilot losses meant even more desperate need for fuel conservation, which meant even less training for replacement pilots. The Luftwaffe was consuming itself. By September and October of 1944, the situation had deteriorated beyond any conceivable recovery. The Luftwaffe was operating with approximately 10% of its minimum fuel requirements. 10%. Entire fighter groups were grounded, their aircraft sitting in perfect mechanical condition, fully armed, ready for combat, but without a drop of fuel in their tanks. Ground crews camouflaged aircraft beneath trees and in dispersal pens, not to hide them from Allied reconnaissance, but because they had become nothing more than expensive inventory, waiting for fuel that would never come. Aviation fuel production, which had peaked at 180,000 tons per month in March of 1944, had collapsed to just 20,000 tons by November, an 89% reduction. According to Albert Speer's post-war testimony, 98% of Germany's aviation fuel production capacity had been knocked out of operation. The few plants still functioning did so intermittently, vulnerable to the next Allied raid, operating on borrowed time. The German army faced similar paralysis. Panzer divisions, the armored spearheads that had conquered Poland, France, and driven deep into the Soviet Union, sat immobilized for lack of diesel fuel. A single Tiger I heavy tank consumed approximately 500 liters of fuel per 100 kilometers traveled. With fuel stocks depleted, these formidable weapons became roadside monuments to a strategic failure of staggering proportions. The full magnitude of Germany's fuel catastrophe became undeniable during the planning for what the High Command hoped would be a decisive winter counteroffensive. In September of 1944, Adolf Hitler resolved to recover Germany's deteriorating military fortunes by launching a massive surprise attack through the Ardennes forest, aimed at recapturing the Belgian port of Antwerp and splitting the Allied armies. This operation, which would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, depended absolutely on fuel to move the panzer divisions, fuel to supply mechanized infantry, and fuel to provide air cover against the inevitable Allied response. Hermann Göring, the Reichsmarschall and Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, was ordered to prepare a supporting air operation. On the 16th of September, 1944, Hitler directed Generalleutnant Werner Kreipe, Chief of the Luftwaffe's General Staff, to prepare the necessary aircraft for the offensive. On the 21st of October, Kreipe ordered Luftwaffe Reich to hand over 7 Jagdgeschwader and Schlachtgeschwader to Air Command West for the future offensive. On the 14th of November, Göring ordered the 2nd and 3rd Jag Division to prepare their units for a large-scale ground attack operation in the Ardennes. Preparations were to be complete by the 27th of November. The plan called for the Luftwaffe to achieve temporary air superiority over the battlefield, enabling German ground forces to advance without the devastating Allied air attacks that had become routine. It was an ambitious goal, particularly given the Luftwaffe's weakened state. But Göring, desperate to restore both his air forces and his own diminished prestige, threw himself into the planning. He promised Hitler that the Luftwaffe would deliver. Across Germany and occupied territories, fighter units began assembling for the operation. Aircraft were pulled from defensive positions. Pilots were transferred from other duties. Ground crews worked frantically to bring aircraft up to operational status. The fuel required for such a large-scale operation would be enormous. Each fighter would need enough fuel not just for the mission itself, but for the approach flight from German bases to the combat zone and the return journey. The totals ran into the thousands of tons. But where would this fuel come from? Germany's aviation fuel production in November of 1944 amounted to approximately 20,000 tons, barely enough to sustain minimal defensive operations, let alone support a major offensive. The answer, as it turned out, involved cannibalizing fuel reserves from across the Reich, draining strategic reserves that could never be replaced, and gambling everything on one desperate throw of the dice. As November turned to December, the truth of Germany's situation could no longer be disguised by propaganda or willful optimism. In a moment that Nicholas von Below, Hitler's Luftwaffe adjutant, would later recount, Hitler acknowledged what had become undeniable even to him. After the failure of the Ardennes offensive in December of 1944, an operation upon which Hitler had staked enormous hopes, the Führer admitted to his inner circle that the war was lost. Not lost on the battlefield, not lost through lack of courage or fighting spirit, but lost through the simple, irreducible arithmetic of industrial capacity. The Battle of the Bulge, which commenced on the 16th of December, 1944, illustrated perfectly the chasm between German ambitions and German capabilities. The offensive initially achieved tactical surprise and made significant gains against unprepared American forces. But the operation had been planned under the assumption of continued poor weather, which would keep Allied aircraft grounded. When the weather cleared on the 23rd of December, Allied tactical air forces devastated German columns. More critically, the German offensive ran out of fuel within days. Panzer spearheads, having penetrated dozens of kilometers into American lines, ground to a halt not because they were defeated in battle, but because their fuel tanks were empty. German commanders had specifically targeted the American fuel depot at Stavelot, knowing that capturing it intact could provide enough fuel to continue the offensive. When German forces came within roughly 1,000 feet of the massive depot on the 17th of December, American engineers set portions of the fuel supplies ablaze, creating a wall of fire that prevented German troops from seizing the prize. Tanks and vehicles that ran out of fuel were simply abandoned. Soldiers who had advanced miles beyond their supply lines were left stranded. The offensive, which had cost Germany its last operational reserves of men and material, collapsed not in a climactic battle but in a series of fuel-starved surrenders and retreats. The Luftwaffe, which had been promised such a prominent role in the offensive, managed to put approximately 500 aircraft into the air on the 16th of December, more than had been seen for months, but nowhere near the thousands that would have been needed to seriously contest Allied air supremacy. Even achieving this modest showing required draining fuel reserves from across Germany. After that initial surge, Luftwaffe operations over the Ardennes declined rapidly. Without fuel to sustain operations, German ground forces were left naked to Allied fighter bombers that roamed the battlefield with impunity, destroying vehicles, supply columns, and any troops caught in the open. But Göring had one more card to play, one final gambit that he believed might yet salvage something from the catastrophe. While the Ardennes offensive consumed Germany's remaining fuel stocks, Göring had quietly assembled a strike force for a different operation, a massive, coordinated attack on Allied airfields in Belgium, Holland, and northern France. The goal was audacious, to destroy hundreds of Allied aircraft on the ground, crippling Allied tactical air power and buying time for Germany to restore its defenses. The operation was codenamed Bodenplatte, baseplate. Planning for Bodenplatte began in the autumn of 1944, running parallel to preparations for the Ardennes offensive. The operation would involve nearly every operational fighter unit the Luftwaffe could muster, more than 800 aircraft from 11 Jagdgeschwader. These fighters would strike 16 Allied airfields at dawn, catching Allied aircraft on the ground before they could respond. Secrecy was paramount. The operation was so closely held that even German Army and Navy units along the planned flight routes were not informed, resulting in tragic friendly fire incidents when the operation finally launched. Bodenplatte was originally planned for the 16th of December, 1944, to coincide with the opening of the Ardennes offensive. But weather conditions were unsuitable, and the operation was postponed. Day after day, Luftwaffe commanders waited for the right combination of clear skies and fog over the target airfields, conditions that would allow German fighters to navigate to their targets while catching Allied aircraft unable to take off. Day after day, the weather refused to cooperate. The precious fuel allocated for the operation sat in tanks and drums at German airfields, growing more precious with each passing day as Germany's synthetic fuel plants continued to burn. Finally, on the morning of the 1st of January, 1945, conditions were deemed acceptable. The order went out, Bodenplatte would launch at dawn. Across Germany, Belgium, and Holland, German pilots climbed into their cockpits in the pre-dawn darkness. Many were experienced veterans, survivors of years of combat. Others were barely trained novices for whom this would be their first operational mission. All of them understood that this would likely be the Luftwaffe's last major offensive operation. There simply wasn't enough fuel for another attempt. At approximately 0820 hours, wave after wave of German fighters swept across Allied airfields at extremely low altitude. At some fields, the attack achieved complete surprise. At others, Allied radar and forward observers provided just enough warning for anti-aircraft crews to man their positions. For the next hour, a savage battle unfolded across the frozen landscape of northwestern Europe. The results were mixed, and ultimately disastrous for the Luftwaffe. Yes, German fighters destroyed or damaged almost 500 Allied aircraft on the ground, a significant number by any measure. Airfields at Eindhoven, Metz, and other locations were temporarily knocked out of action. But Allied aircraft, unlike German ones, could be rapidly replaced. American and British factories were producing thousands of fighters per month. Aircraft destroyed on New Year's Day would be replaced within weeks. The Luftwaffe's losses, by contrast, were irreplaceable. Over 214 German aircraft were lost, with approximately 143 pilots killed or captured. Many of these losses came not from Allied fighters, which were largely caught on the ground, but from Allied anti-aircraft fire. German pilots, many undertrained and unfamiliar with low-level attack profiles, flew too slowly or predictably. They were shot down by their own forces, who hadn't been informed of the operation and fired on anything flying at low altitude. They crashed due to navigation errors, fuel exhaustion, or simple lack of skill. Among the dead was Oberstleutnant Alfred Drüschel, a decorated veteran who had survived years of combat only to be shot down by Allied anti-aircraft fire over Belgium. Dozens of experienced Geschwader and Gruppe commanders were lost. The Luftwaffe had gambled its remaining cadre of experienced pilots and lost. Worse still, the operation consumed the last substantial fuel reserves available to the Luftwaffe. After Bodenplatte, German fighter units across Europe found themselves with aircraft but no fuel to operate them. The few missions flown in January and February of 1945 were token efforts, small-scale intercepts that made no meaningful impact on the tide of Allied bombers that continued to pulverize German cities and industrial sites. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Back in Berlin, the full dimensions of the catastrophe were becoming impossible to ignore. Albert Speer, reviewing production reports and fuel statistics, drafted another memorandum to Hitler. Dated the 28th of July, 1944, this document laid out in stark terms what the fuel crisis meant for Germany's ability to continue the war. Speer implored Hitler to reserve a significantly larger portion of fighter plane production for protecting the homeland hydrogenation plants, the very facilities that produced aviation fuel. The logic was inescapable: without fuel, fighters couldn't fly. Without flying fighters, fuel plants couldn't be defended. Without defended fuel plants, there would be no fuel. It was a death spiral from which there was no escape. By November of 1944, Speer sent yet another memorandum, this one even more dire. Meanwhile, the army, too, had become virtually immobile because of the fuel shortage, he wrote. The Wehrmacht, which had conquered most of Europe through mechanized warfare, could barely move. Panzer divisions sat in defensive positions because there was no fuel to redeploy them. Trucks that should have been supplying frontline units with ammunition and food sat idle. The entire German war machine was grinding to a halt not through lack of equipment, but through lack of the petroleum that made that equipment function. Hitler's responses to these memorandums revealed a leader increasingly detached from material reality. Rather than accepting the logical conclusion that Germany must seek peace before total collapse, Hitler continued to speak of wonder weapons and final victories. He placed his faith in the V-2 rocket, which consumed enormous resources to produce minimal military effect. He obsessed over the Messerschmitt 262 jet fighter, seeing in its revolutionary technology a way to reverse Germany's fortunes. He refused to countenance any discussion of negotiated settlement, threatening with dire consequences anyone who suggested such defeatism. The tragedy was that Hitler was half right. The Me-262 was indeed a remarkable aircraft, capable of speeds approaching 600 miles per hour, fast enough to outrun any Allied fighter. Its 30mm cannons could shred American bombers with just a few hits. In the hands of experienced pilots, the 262 was devastatingly effective. Small numbers of these jets, operating from late 1944 onward, shot down dozens of Allied aircraft while suffering minimal losses themselves. But by the time the 262 reached operational service, Germany lacked the fuel to produce and train enough jet pilots to make any strategic difference. Jet engines consumed fuel voraciously, even more than conventional piston engines. A single 262 sortie required hundreds of liters of specialized jet fuel. With total aviation fuel production measured in thousands of tons per month, barely enough for minimal conventional operations, there was simply no fuel available to support a large jet fighter force, even if the aircraft could have been produced in sufficient numbers. The same pattern repeated across Germany's late-war wonder weapons programs. The Heinkel 162 Volksjäger, the People's Fighter, was designed as a cheap, mass-producible jet fighter that could be flown by Hitler Youth with minimal training. Approximately 320 were built before factories were overrun by Allied forces. But even these simplified jets required fuel, and by 1945, Germany's aviation fuel production had dropped to 0.5% of what it had been in early 1944. It didn't matter how many aircraft were produced if there was no fuel to fly them. The Messerschmitt 163 Comet rocket interceptor, capable of speeds approaching 600 miles per hour, entered limited service in May of 1944. This extraordinary aircraft could climb to 30,000 feet in under 3 minutes and attack Allied bomber formations with devastating effectiveness. but it had only 7 minutes of powered flight time before its rocket fuel was exhausted. And that rocket fuel, a mixture of hydrazine hydrate and methanol, was itself made from petroleum products that Germany could no longer produce in sufficient quantities. The few comets that did fly operationally achieved minimal results before the program was effectively abandoned due to fuel shortages and the aircraft's tendency to explode on landing. By February of 1945, German aviation fuel production had collapsed to a trickle equaling approximately 0.5% of the production levels achieved in the first 4 months of 1944. Read that again, 0.5%. From 136,000 tons per month in early 1944, to approximately 700 tons per month in February of 1945. The Luftwaffe, which had begun the war as the world's most fearsome air force, had been reduced to near total impotence not through lack of aircraft or lack of courage, but through simple industrial arithmetic. The Wehrmacht faced the same paralysis. By early 1945, German armored units were never more than 30 days away from complete fuel exhaustion. Tiger and Panther tanks, among the most formidable armored vehicles produced by any nation during the war, sat abandoned along roadsides throughout Germany, not because they were destroyed in combat, but because their fuel tanks were empty and there was no fuel to refill them. The vaunted German army, which had pioneered mechanized warfare, found itself increasingly dependent on horse-drawn transportation. Over 1.1 million horses served in the Wehrmacht throughout the war, a greater use of equestrian transport than in any previous military conflict in history. The spring of 1945 brought no relief, only the inevitable conclusion of a catastrophe years in the making. As Allied armies closed in from east and west, the Luftwaffe's fighter units could mount only token resistance. On some days in March of 1945, American bomber formations reported being attacked by large groups of German fighters, sometimes numbering 150 aircraft, demonstrating that Germany still possessed operational aircraft and pilots willing to fly them. But these missions were isolated incidents, desperate last stands that consumed precious fuel stocks that could never be replenished. The priorities had shifted in these final months. What little aviation fuel Germany could still produce was reserved for elite jet fighter units like Jagdverband 44, formed in February of 1945 under the command of Adolf Hitler, the former General der Jagdflieger who had fallen from grace after the fighter pilots' revolt of January 1945. JV-44 was composed almost exclusively of high-scoring aces flying the Messerschmitt 262. These men, survivors who had accumulated hundreds of kills between them, represented the last remnants of the Luftwaffe's once formidable fighter force. They flew when they could, achieved remarkable individual successes, but could not alter the strategic situation. There simply weren't enough of them, and there wasn't enough fuel. For every sortie JV-44 flew, hundreds of Allied bombers struck German targets unopposed. The skeletal Luftwaffe presence served mainly to justify continued Allied fighter escort missions. Allied air superiority was so complete by March of 1945 that fighter-bombers roamed over German front lines virtually at will, attacking troops, supply columns, and anything that moved. German soldiers learned to move only at night or under heavy fog, when Allied aircraft couldn't operate. Daylight belonged entirely to the Allies. The fuel crisis had poisoned every aspect of Germany's military capability. Pilot training, already reduced to criminally inadequate levels, essentially ceased. New pilots arrived at operational units with as little as 30 to 50 hours of total flight time, barely enough to take off and land safely, let alone engage in aerial combat. These young men, many still teenagers, were being sent to their deaths in aircraft they barely knew how to fly, against enemies who had hundreds of hours of combat experience. The Luftwaffe's pilot death rate in the final months of the war reached appalling levels. Units that received 10 new pilots one week would have lost 8 or 9 of them by the following week. Ground operations fared no better. During the final Soviet offensives into Germany in April of 1945, Wehrmacht commanders repeatedly found themselves unable to execute even basic tactical movements because their vehicles lacked fuel. Panzer divisions ordered to counterattack advancing Soviet forces couldn't reach their designated positions. Supply trucks that should have been evacuating wounded or bringing ammunition to frontline units sat immobilized. The vaunted German army, which had conquered Poland in weeks and France in 40 days, had been reduced to near immobility. Soldiers fought and died in defensive positions they couldn't leave because there was no fuel to move them. This was the reality that Adolf Hitler confronted in the final weeks of the Third Reich, and his response revealed everything about both the man and the regime he had created. Rather than accepting responsibility for the strategic decisions that had led to this catastrophe, the invasion of the Soviet Union without securing adequate fuel supplies, the failure to prioritize fuel production over other industrial targets, the refusal to implement strategic bombing doctrine when Germany had air superiority, Hitler chose nihilism. On the 19th of March, 1945, Hitler issued what came to be known as the Nero Decree, after the Roman emperor who, according to legend, had burned Rome. This order mandated the systematic destruction of Germany's remaining infrastructure, factories, transportation networks, utilities, anything that might conceivably be of use to the advancing Allies. According to testimony from those present, including Albert Speer and others in Hitler's inner circle, Hitler's reasoning was chillingly simple: if Germany could not win, then Germany deserved to be destroyed. In discussions with Speer, Hitler was quoted as responding to concerns about the German population's survival by saying, "It is not necessary to worry about their needs for elemental survival." He went further, stunning Speer by declaring that the future belongs entirely to the strong people of the East, meaning that if Germany was defeated, the Slavic peoples Hitler had spent years denigrating as subhuman were apparently more deserving of survival than the Germans themselves. This was Hitler's final answer to the fuel crisis, to the grounded Luftwaffe, to the immobilized Wehrmacht: total destruction. If German engineering and production couldn't overcome industrial capacity and resource limitations, then everything should burn. It was the logic of a man who had never truly understood that warfare in the industrial age was fundamentally about production, logistics, and resources, not willpower, not ideology, not even tactical brilliance. Albert Speer, to his limited credit, refused to implement the Nero Decree. Throughout March and April of 1945, Speer quietly countermanded Hitler's destruction orders, instructing factory managers and military commanders to surrender facilities intact to advancing Allied forces. This insubordination represented the first clear sign that Hitler's authority was collapsing. In earlier years, such defiance would have resulted in immediate arrest and execution. But by March of 1945, Hitler no longer possessed the power to enforce his will. The regime was disintegrating, held together only by momentum and fear. The fuel crisis that had paralyzed the Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht was, in many ways, the physical manifestation of Germany's larger strategic failure. The Third Reich had waged war on the assumption that superior training, doctrine, and equipment would compensate for inferior industrial and resource bases. For a time, this assumption appeared valid. German forces achieved stunning victories against enemies who possessed greater resources but lacked Germany's tactical proficiency and operational art. But as the war expanded and prolonged, those resource disparities became insurmountable. The United States alone produced over 276,000 military aircraft between 1941 and 1945, more than Britain and Russia combined from 1943 onward, and more than Germany and Japan together throughout the entire war. When Germany was producing 36,000 aircraft in 1944, its peak production year, the United States was producing twice that number with far less strain on its economy and workforce. When German factories struggled to produce tens of thousands of tons of synthetic fuel per month, American oil fields were producing over 1 billion barrels annually, more than 100 times Germany's total production. These numbers weren't the result of superior American or British engineering. German engineers were arguably the finest in the world. The Messerschmitt 262 jet fighter, the Type XXI U-boat, the Tiger tank, these were technological marvels that Allied engineers struggled to match. But technology alone couldn't overcome the fundamental arithmetic of industrial production. An American P-51 Mustang might not have been as technologically advanced as a Me-262, but the Americans could produce 50 Mustangs for every 262 that rolled off German assembly lines. And critically, the Americans had unlimited fuel to fly their Mustangs, while German jets sat on the ground for lack of aviation gasoline. The story of the grounded Luftwaffe serves as a powerful illustration of a truth that military planners and strategists had been learning throughout the 20th century, that modern warfare is fundamentally industrial in nature. Superior tactics can achieve local victories. Better training can produce advantageous kill ratios. Advanced technology can provide temporary edges. But in a prolonged conflict between industrial powers, the side with greater productive capacity will almost always prevail, provided it can sustain that production and protect its resources. Germany's synthetic fuel industry was, in many ways, a technological marvel, a chemical engineering achievement that converted abundant coal into usable petroleum products through processes that few other nations had mastered. But this achievement meant nothing once Allied air forces gained the capability to systematically destroy those facilities faster than they could be repaired. Germany could have had the most advanced fuel production technology in the world, and in many ways it did, but without the air defenses to protect that production, or the strategic depth to disperse it beyond Allied bomber range, that technology was rendered meaningless. The irony that opens this story, of Oberst Werner Bombeck standing amid rows of brand new fighters that couldn't fly for lack of fuel, encapsulates the entire trajectory of Germany's war effort. The Third Reich achieved remarkable feats of production, engineering, and organization. German factories, despite relentless bombing, produced more aircraft in 1944 than in any previous year. German engineers developed jet engines, rocket planes, and guided missiles years ahead of Allied equivalents. German pilots, even in the final months, demonstrated courage and skill that earned grudging respect from their enemies. But none of it was enough, because the fundamental strategic calculus was fatally flawed from the beginning. Germany had attempted to fight a global war against opponents who collectively controlled the vast majority of the world's industrial capacity and natural resources. The Soviet Union had oil. The British Empire had oil. The United States had oceans of oil. Germany had coal and the chemical processes to convert it into fuel, processes that required massive industrial facilities, skilled workers, exotic materials, and time. Facilities that could be bombed. Workers who could be killed. Materials that couldn't be replaced. Time that ran out. In the end, the question of what Hitler said when the Luftwaffe grounded 2,000 planes for lack of fuel isn't really about a specific quotation or recorded conversation. It's about a fundamental failure to comprehend the nature of industrial warfare. Hitler never truly accepted that production capacity mattered more than willpower, that logistics trumped ideology, that resource access outweighed tactical brilliance. When confronted with the undeniable reality of Germany's fuel crisis, his response was to blame subordinates, to double down on wonder weapons, and finally to order Germany's complete destruction rather than admit that his strategic vision had been catastrophically wrong from the start. The Luftwaffe that had terrorized Europe in 1940 and 41, that had seemed invincible during the early campaigns of the war, ended its existence as a hollow force, thousands of aircraft on paper, dozens operational in practice. Not because German pilots lacked courage. Not because German aircraft were inferior. But because the fuel tanks were empty, and there was nothing left to fill them with. It stands as one of history's starkest lessons in the limits of technology and training when divorced from industrial capacity and strategic resources. A lesson that resonates far beyond the specific context of World War II, touching on fundamental questions about what truly constitutes military power in the modern age. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.